On this bracing early spring day, when the japonica has just come into bloom in the court, and when the late afternoon light is returning to this wonderful chapel, I am delighted to welcome you all to Harris Manchester College. I am Claire MacDonald, I'm a Unitarian minister, and I'm the chaplain here. And on behalf of our principal, Beth Breeze, our governing body, our wider college community, and the Manchester Academy Trust, which supports this annual event, I want to welcome our speaker for this year's Manchester Academy Trust Lecture, Professor William Whyte. Welcome, William. The Manchester Lecture is designed to address the histories of the college, both material and cultural. And this year's subject, the Worthington family across generations, speaks to social, educational, and spiritual ambition, and the story of how this place came to be. This year and this week, as it happens, we are also celebrating 30 years as a constituent college of the University of Oxford. What was first Manchester Academy started as a dissenting institution, founded by Unitarians and committed to free thinking, conversation, co-education. All around this college, inscribed on windows and framed on walls, in the chapel, in the Tate Library, in corridors, in public rooms and teaching spaces, you will find the names and faces and places associated with that history. And I want to thank my colleagues, our fellow librarian Kate Alderson-Smith and Dr. Sophie Gibson, for the work they've done in drawing out material which you can see in a vitrine in our entrance hall about all of this. But we have, for instance, the Charles Well-beloved room, the pictures of principals and distinguished women and men from L.P. Jackson, Joseph Estlin Carpenter, principals, James Martineau, Francis Power Cobb on our stairwell, and all those names, Wedgwoods, Nettlefolds, Barballs, Crosskeys, and others. The college is no longer a Unitarian foundation, but it remains committed to progressive, inclusive values, imagination, independent thinking, supporting LGBTQ+ identities, and lifelong learning. It is, as you know, uniquely a college for students who are over 21. We are delighted in this anniversary year to welcome William Whyte, both because he's a superlative architectural historian, general historian, social historian too, but because he too is a wide-ranging interdisciplinary thinker and writer. He's Professor of Social and Architectural History, Fellow of St John's College, Oxford, Trustee of English Heritage. He's a trustee of the Gladstone Library, the Radcliffe Trust. He serves on the Fabric Commission of Westminster Abbey and the Heritage Committee of the British Academy. And as you will all know, he oversaw the building of the Stephen A. Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities. But as a historian of architecture, he has a special interest in institutions, in schools, in universities and churches. Sits on the London Advisory Committee of Historic England, edits Oxfordshire, and he serves as a curator of the Bodleian Library. But as a historian, I'm running ahead of myself here, his most recent books include Unlocking the Church, The Lost Secrets of Victorian Sacred Space, and The University, A History in Stone, Silk and Blood. He's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the Society of Antiquities, and surprisingly, he also has time to practice as an ordained priest. And in all of these roles, he's someone whose gift is to speak, to connect, and to bring past, present, and future into play. And before I concede the floor to William, please make sure you have turned your phones off. Please refrain from taking pictures during the talk. We're streaming, and the talk will also be available online. And at the end, we'll have time for questions before leaving here and convening for drinks. So to begin, I give you William Whyte, our speaker for the Manchester Lecture 2026.
Thank you ever so much. What a terrifying introduction. And how kind of you to come out today as I speak about this extraordinary family and celebrate this remarkable college. It's a huge pleasure to be here and a tremendous honour to be asked to speak about this important architectural family, important Unitarian family, and just as importantly, an important Manchester family. But the reason, of course, I'm here to speak to you today is that they are an important Harris Manchester family. The Worthingtons, and here is a picture from the opening of the college in 1893, the Worthingtons between them gave shape and form to the first Unitarian college in Oxford. A process which was interesting, intriguing, but also more important and more troublesome than might be expected. The Manchester College, when it moved here and opened here in 1893, was part of a broader movement within the University of Oxford, which was propelled and given force by the removal of the final religious tests in everything but the Faculty of Theology in 1871. And what that meant was that a whole succession of those who had, since the Test Acts of the 1660s, been excluded from the University of Oxford, could come to this university and found institutions. And of course, that's precisely what they do. But each of those institutions takes on a different architectural form. Each of them is trying to do something different, and each of them is expressing something of its identity and its ambitions as it does so. To the top, of course, we have Campion Hall, ex-Pope's Hall, the Catholic college, which was given form by Lutyens in the interwar period, a decision that was taken by the socially climbing and intellectually as well as religiously ambitious Father Darcy, the man behind Campion Hall, after a discussion in a smart London hotel. They chose Lutyens because they wanted Campion Hall to establish the social position of this new Catholic foundation. Beneath it, of course, is Regent's Park College, who went to an otherwise rather unknown but interesting architect, T. Harold Hughes, a Glasgow architect who brought to Oxford something completely different. It's a college which both inhabits a quadrangle but also rejects the Gothic revival, which is so characteristic of so many other colleges. But above all, Harris Manchester is in dialogue with, or at any rate ought to be considered in relation to, its near neighbour, Mansfield College. Mansfield, when it opened in 1889, was greeted as an embodiment of Congregationalist ideas. At its opening, Principal Fairbairn, the first principal of Mansfield, gave a sermon entitled, "We Claim Our Part in the Great Inheritance." And what he did was to build a college employing a young architect called Basil Champneys, who claimed, somewhat implausibly, to be descended from William of Wykeham, the founder of New College, to build a college which was, at one and the same time, distinctively Congregationalist and yet utterly part of Oxford. So looking at the Worthingtons and looking at what they built here will tell us something about what the founders of this college were seeking to do. It will tell us something about how they hoped this college to be understood. It will tell us something about what they thought the future of the college was going to be. And that's why it's so interesting that although, like Mansfield, Manchester College was built in a Gothic revival style, it was not designed by an establishment architect like Champneys. It was not designed by a London architect. It was not designed along the ideals established by William of Wykeham at New College. It was a totally different plan, built in a totally different stone, and it has always stood somewhat apart from the great late 19th century architectural developments of Oxford. When it opened in that October of 1895, it's fair to say that reviews were mixed about the arrival of this Manchester College built in Derbyshire stone and designed by a Lancastrian architect. It was, wrote one Anglican clergyman, built in an obtrusively Unitarian style. So to understand this, is to understand something about the college itself, but it's also to understand something about the people who designed it. And to understand that, we need to think about the Worthington dynasty, which is a word I will return to again and again, because that is precisely what was brought to bear here. There were heaps and heaps of Worthingtons. I could spend the rest of the next 45 minutes itemising individual Worthingtons and their role within Unitarian education, their role within social reform, even their role within planning and architecture. Put it simply, there were 15 Worthingtons here at the opening of the college. 8 of them had donated money towards it, and generations of them would be involved and had been involved. Indeed, the 3 I'm going to be talking to about, Thomas Worthington at the top, the great founder of this architectural dynasty. Thomas Worthington was descended from a line of Worthingtons, almost all of whom had been educated in Manchester College, and several of whom had taught in it. He had memories as a young man of going to visit the college in its previous York base, and could recall, when it opened in '93, that successions of his family had been part of that. I'm only going to talk to you today about those 3 people. Thomas Worthington at the top, who was born in 1826, and of his 11 children, I am going to talk about 2. The oldest of the children, Percy Scott Worthington, who went into partnership with his father in 1895, and his youngest child, Hubert Worthington, born in 1886, who is not involved, so far as I can tell, in the design of this college, but is enormously useful because he's only one of the Worthingtons who ever tells us what he's thinking. Thomas Worthington, at the opening of this building in '93, said that he was incapable of making a speech, and demonstrates that over a paragraph of somewhat underwhelming prose. Percy Scott Worthington, his son, who was decorated, given a knighthood, the winner of the Royal Gold Medal of the Royal Institute of British Architects, a very unusual development for a provincial architect. He, at the presentation, similarly describes himself as incapable of making a speech, and similarly demonstrates that that's true. Hubert Worthington, however, is excessively voluble, so we will be hearing a lot from him. Architectural dynasties are not unusual. The truth is that there are many and varied of them. James Payn, the great 18th century architect, and his son, James Payn Knight, Quinlan Terry, the great contemporary classicist, and his son, Francis Terry, or the Gilbert Scott dynasty, or the Bucklers, who have a blue plaque in the Holywell Street. There are successive dynasties in architecture, and the Worthingtons are just one. And that's something which is the product of wider patterns of behaviour amongst the middle classes in the 19th century, the fact that successive generations of civil servants are all from the same family, successive generations of teachers, but it's also a product of the very distinctive way in which architecture operated as a calling, as a career, before it became a profession. Training for architecture in the period before the 20th century was largely based around an apprenticeship model. And so it was easy for young men to join their father's practice to be trained. It was also the case, of course, that until the 1930s, at which point it becomes compulsory for anyone calling themselves an architect to have an architectural qualification, up to that point, it was almost impossible to determine who was and who was not an architect. The fabulously named August Reichenberger, a great German architect, arrives in England in the 1850s as Thomas Worthington is making his name, and confesses that he's surprised to see a sign in a shop window which advertises somebody as a hairdresser and architect, because almost anyone can be one. So So how does one know you can trust the person that you are entrusting large sums of money and a huge great deal of confidence? Well, the best way of doing it is to employ someone you know, or, failing that, the son of someone you know. And Hubert Worthington is well aware of that. In 1927, he gives an address to the young architects training at the Royal Academy Schools and offers this rather disconcerting advice. Unless you have an uncle or an aunt to give you a job, how can you ever show your talent? And he certainly had uncles and aunts. This is Percy Scott's wedding. You can see him up there in his bride. And you can see just down here, I hope, stand there. Here is Percy Scott, and down here is Thomas Worthington, and there's little Hubert. There's him there. So this is their wedding in 1893. It's also the case that it's not just family that gives you jobs in this period, it's connections in general. When in 1848 Thomas Worthington leaves the man who was trained him as an architect, William Whyte, a London architect running a large London firm, the advice he's given is clear. You have many friends in the north, go down to Manchester and hang a sign out there. And he does exactly that. So if we're to understand the Worthingtons, it's not just a conceit to put them together as a dynasty, it's actually an explanation for their success, and it's also a way of understanding them as a whole and the role they played in this college. But of course, it also creates problems. Thomas Worthington sets up his firm in 1849. Hubert Worthington doesn't die until 1963. We're going to be covering quite a lot of time. We're going to be covering time that takes us from Thomas Worthington, Albert Memorial in Manchester, Percy Scott Worthington's Masonic Temple in Manchester, to Hubert Worthington's buildings at the University of Manchester. We're going to have to cover a long time, and that will raise questions not just about the reality of the dynasty, but also about how it actually functioned. So to do that, I'm going to try and break this talk down into 4 parts. I want to think about where the Worthingtons came from. I want to think about how their practice developed. I want to think, this is perhaps the most important element, about what this tells us about their values as architects and as people and as members of a prominent Unitarian family and important figures in Manchester social, political and economic life. And then I want to think about how all that might explain why this obtrusively Unitarian college looks as it does, and what decisions they were making here that gave the form to this new establishment within Oxford. Let's begin with the origins now. Let's begin with Thomas Worthington. Worthington was, as I said, born in a prominent Unitarian family in Cheshire, and very quickly as a young man moved to Manchester. His family was stalwarts of this Cross Street Chapel, which was perhaps the most famous of all Unitarian chapels. It would be the pulpit that William Gaskell occupied. It would be one of the great Unitarian foundations. And this is it as he would have known it in 1835 as a young man, as a young boy in fact, at 11. He was one of a large, prominent, successful, upwardly mobile, middle-class Unitarian family. And he was determined, it seems, from an early age to become an architect. And so is apprenticed and trains and travels. He travels extensively in Europe, and then in 1849 he establishes his practice in Manchester, just as Whyte had recommended he should. And he doesn't have instant success, but he does have relatively swift success. The key building in his career is undoubtedly wasn't just in London that memorials went up. Albert, who would of course be mourned by Queen Victoria for the rest of her life, was mourned across England by a surprisingly large number of people. The Royal Albert Hall, the Albert Memorial, the Prince Albert Memorial College in Framlingham, Suffolk, and in Manchester. A competition was held to provide a housing for the statue which the Town Council of Manchester had determined would be put up in Albert Square at the heart of the rebuilt civic centre of the city. And that success prompted further success as he builds the police courts, as he builds the Memorial Hall in Albert Square, as he builds Ardwick Hospital, as he builds a succession of large and prominent buildings in and around Manchester. Thomas Worthington really is utterly based in Manchester, utterly convinced of Manchester, and also somebody who, at least as a young man, does write to a little bit, to a certain extent, about Manchester architecture. He says, he draws a comparison between Manchester in the 1850s and the 1860s. He draws a comparison between this thriving commercial centre and the great Renaissance cities of the past, Venice, Genoa, Florence, Siena, and indeed he writes about the fact that just as each of them had evolved their own architectural style, so Manchester too was evolving its own architectural style, although as you can see, an architectural style heavily influenced by them too. His son, Percy Scott Worthington, is able to use his father's financial and social success. He has a broader view, he has a more national experience. He's born in 1864 and is sent to board at Clifton College in Bristol, and then studies at Corpus Christi College in Oxford. And his rising social status is reflected in the fact that many of his buildings are rather smart people. On the left is Burrows Green near Kendal. On the right is the extraordinary Radbrook Hall, Piova Superior in Cheshire, built for a Manchester businessman, built for Claude Henry. And you can see, it's not just the style has changed, it's also that actually in many respects he's building for a different class of people altogether. But he doesn't leave Manchester. His office is still there, he doesn't forget Manchester. These are buildings built for Manchester people, and in Manchester he leaves a remarkable legacy too, with the arts faculty at the University of Manchester, with the Masonic Temple in the centre of town, and it's for the Masonic Temple that he does, as I said, receive the Royal Gold Medal of the Royal Institute of British Architects, celebrated by Lord Simon, no less, a great Liberal politician, former Lord Mayor of Manchester, as a man who's not only a Manchester man, but also the son of a Manchester man. The achievement of Dr. Worthington is that he was born in Manchester and lived in Manchester, and yet has preserved his soul, and has done so much to make Manchester a more beautiful place. Thomas Worthington's first wife died, and he remarried, and that is why he ends up with his 11 children. The youngest of whom is Hubert Worthington. He's the youngest son, and he again has a very different upbringing from that of his father. Percy Scott went to Clifton. Hubert Worthington goes to Sedbergh, and he is enlisted, has a very good war, and receives many tributes and receives many honours, and becomes a great friend of, amongst other people, Rupert Brooke, and then after the war establishes himself as an architect. And this is his War Memorial Cloister at Sedbergh. But like his elder brother, Hubert Worthington, who continues to maintain, he goes into practice in partnership with his elder brother Percy in 1919, maintains the office in Manchester, continues to have that local presence, but also has a still more national existence even than Percy. He is responsible in the the aftermath of the Second World War for the initial sites of rebuilding in the Temple Hall. He's responsible for rebuilding a number of livery halls, including Brewers Hall. But above all, Hubert Worthington is a great Oxford architect, although he builds in a period which is not often regarded as a great moment of architectural development. Hubert Worthington is the architect of Worthington Building, now Union College, of Betts Hall, of Pembroke, of Forestry, now Plant Sciences Building, of the library, which is now part of UNIV, of the music faculty, which is about to become part of Christ Church. He is a figure who is deeply embedded, a deeply establishment figure. But again, not one that forgets Manchester. He is responsible for work, not least the University Dental Hospital at Manchester, and still more the project of which he was most proud, it seems, which is the restoration of Manchester Cathedral after the Second World War. So what we have is a story of social ascent and a story of ever-growing solidity as they're absorbed within the establishment, but never once abandoning their connection to Manchester, never once losing sight of their commitment to that particular town. The social ascent, the broadening of their horizons, the growing national profile, which leads Percy to be awarded the Royal Gold Medal, which leads Hubert to become Professor of Architecture at the Royal College of Art, which leads both of them to be knighted and to become major figures, and Hubert to become a Royal Academician. That social ascent is accompanied by, and in some respects, bound up in, the development of them as architects and the development of their interests in style. It's not just social change we witness, it's also stylistic change. And to a certain extent, that's inevitable in a practice that lasts as long as it does. Worthington and Son does not cease to be a Manchester architectural practice until about 10 years ago. But it's also revealing the changing identities and changing vision that they present is also revealing of who trained them, who employed them, and how their interests as architects and individuals change. Thomas Worthington, founder of the dynasty, well, he was trained by two very contrasting architects in the 1830s and 1840s. Henry Bowman, who built very little but becomes a very important figure in providing some of the ammunition that powers the Gothic revival, and William Tite, a London architect who is chiefly known for the building of the Royal Exchange, and who, as you can see, is much more obviously committed to the Greek revival. More important than their training, than his training, however, it's clear, was Worthington's travels and his reading. He reads Ruskin, he travels to France, he travels to Italy, and all of that becomes apparent if one looks at his denials. You can see the absorption of Ruskinian Venetian Gothic in his Albert Square building. You can see his absorption of some of the French late medieval Gothic in his hospital buildings. And you can see that that is a palette, a set of ideas that he continues to play with more or less consistently throughout the whole of his career. Like many of his generation, however, Percy Worthington is more influenced by William Morris. He's a figure of the arts and crafts. He's a figure that becomes interested in a wider variety of styles than his father. Ironically, whilst Thomas Worthington is brought up by people who build classical architecture, like William Tite, he never builds a classical building himself. He's completely convinced by the Gothic revival and the claims that are made about the Gothic revival as a distinctively English, distinctively Christian kind of style, which can be made modern in the Victorian age. Percy Worthington, by contrast, is a much more eclectic figure. He's somebody who's more happy to experiment with kind of pared down arts and crafts vernacular that is building Woodgarth, or a sort of interesting neoclassical meets modern at the Liverpool Insurance Office in Manchester in the middle, or a kind of almost Manchester Grammar School. And Hubert, who is after all 20 years younger than Percy Scott, almost a generation younger, well, he's influenced by other figures again. Hubert is trained first in his father's and brother's practice in Worthington and Sons, but then is trained by Lutyens. He's also, as a professor at the Royal College of Art, deeply influenced by William Rothenstein, who is the head of the Royal College of Art, and enormously influenced. It's clear if one looks at what he read and what he's built, and above all in what he wrote and in what he said, hugely influenced by Geoffrey Scott, whose architecture of humanism represented a complete overturning, or at any rate a profound attack upon the Gothic revival. And the result is most evident, not in his buildings, although it's evident there, but in his work which he takes up in the middle of the Second World War, designing war graves and cemeteries. He's appointed in 1943 as the Royal War Graves Commission expert in North Africa. And you can see, if you go to El Alamein, the influence of Lutyens and the influence of that axial planning which is developed there. But you can also see it in buildings like the Best Building at Pembroke, which he builds in 1955. And you can see too that as his career and his life comes to a close in the 1950s and early 1960s, he's also, as I said, beginning to experiment with modernist ideals. So although they're part of a dynasty, although they're part of a firm that is founded in 1849 and continues until 2012, although they're part of this world, each of them is different and each of them expresses a different stylistic commitment, each of them is engaged in a different kind of building. And that's because for these people, style was not just about fashion, it was also about values. It was about the values that these buildings communicated, and it was about the ideals that these buildings enforced. The Victorians conflated ethics and aesthetics. What was beautiful was also true, what was true was also beautiful. That same idea underpins so much of what modern architecture in the 20th century assumed, that if only you built good buildings, then it would produce good people. And the Worthingtons embraced those ideas. What underlines so much of what we've just looked at is a shared commitment, which is expressed in different architectural forms, but a shared commitment to the idea that architecture is fundamentally about building a better world in some respects. And that's true right from the beginning. Here is Thomas Worthington in the 1850s, right back to 1858, providing designs for improved baths and improved hospitals and improved social facilities for the poor of Manchester. His first public statements from this intolerably private man were all concerned with the idea of providing better architectural environments for the poor of Manchester. He was an active member of the Manchester Statistical Society, and he was also, as a result of that, deeply involved in the provision of better sanitary conditions for the poor of Manchester, better hospitals for the poor, and also better homes for the poor. And he becomes, as a result, one of the leading hospital architects of the mid-19th century. Crumpshall Hospital, there is Withington Hospital. These are deeply important buildings, so important that Florence Nightingale engages in a correspondence with him, and she establishes that these are, from her point of view at any rate, the leading hospital buildings of the age. And that commitment to social architecture, to the architecture of hospitals and the architecture of health, is one that he passes on to his sons. Here is Knutsford Cottage Hospital, Percy Worthington on the left, and the Dental Hospital in Manchester by Hubert Worthington on the right. And that ideal, the fact that they're something to their social connections, and the fact that they know all the people who are supporting this in Manchester. It owes something to the good fortune they have of being part of this dynasty of architects who are able to get jobs. But above all else, it's clear, if you read them, Thomas Worthington's halting descriptions of the work he's doing in the Manchester Statistical Societies, or Hubert Worthington's more capacious descriptions of them in the 20th century, it's clear that a lot of this grows out of their background as Unitarians, and in particular two ideas that underpin what they're doing in these buildings, and what I would argue also underpin the stylistic changes that we can see in their architecture. The first is a commitment to social service, and the second is a commitment to the idea of being on the right side of history, of being profoundly progressive. Now, I cannot show that in Thomas Worthington's words, I cannot show it in Percy Scott Worthington's words, but we get glimpses of it if we look at Hubert Worthington. We also get a sense of Hubert Worthington's social standing and his contentment and happiness amongst the elite. When we read one of his lectures of the 1920s, modernism, he claimed, is a word that many of us consider synonymous with Bolshevism. But we must face this controversial topic that divides the art world into such disastrous factions. The new progressive spirit of the age cannot be waved away with a die-hard gesture. There is something here. If it is vital and progressive, we should rather try to guide it into safe channels. It cannot be suppressed. So, what you get the idea that architecture is deeply, deeply progressive. And it changes because the world changes, and so should architecture change. But they do this, of course, from a position, as this suggests, position of deep comfort in their own social standing, of deep familiarity with the elites, and with a sense of their own importance. You can see why. Here are their houses. These are not poor people. When one talks about 19th century nonconformity, the difficulty is that so many people have a vision of a small Welsh chapel on the hillside. That is simply not true for the rich and expansive Manchester Unitarians that we are talking about. We are talking about upper middle class people with upper middle class values, distinguished from other upper middle class people, really only because they are Unitarians, and really only because that means they have a commitment to social progress, and because they have a commitment to the idea of change over time. And we can capture that if we look at what the Worthingtons themselves say about their social responsibilities. Here's Thomas Worthington in 1860, who argues that the main question facing architects and social reformers of the period is this: how shall our lowest classes be prevented from becoming a permanent caste, descending from generation to generation, fixed in habits of degradation and sin? This is a profoundly paternalist idea, and one, of course, is quoting Martineau, whose bust is up in the hall here, a great Unitarian, and up in the library here, a great Unitarian figure with a similarly paternalist progressive view of what the role is. And Hubert Worthington, I think, makes it even more profound when he talks about how important architecture is. And he observes that the building is up for keeps. What a thought! It cannot be put in the cook's bedroom when we grow tired of it. It's a glimpse of another world. It's a glimpse, certainly, of a degree of social confidence and material success. It tells us something about who these people were. And so if we bear that in mind, if we bear in mind the fact that these are an architectural dynasty woven into the life of Manchester Unitarianism, that this is an architectural dynasty which does extremely well out of that, which becomes not merely establishment figures in Manchester, but weaves itself into the broader national establishment, the establishment educated in public schools in Oxbridge, the establishment which finds a home in Oxford colleges, in Inns of Court, in the Royal Academy, an establishment which welcomes them with prizes and with knighthoods and with other forms of celebration. And yet, because of their involvement in Manchester life, these are people who are never totally divorced from the social problems of the age. Because of their commitment to Unitarianism, these are people who have a profoundly progressive idea of the passage of time and a deep conviction that to maintain their place, but also above all to reform the world and to make Manchester and England a better place, is to embrace progressive ideology, even if, like modernism, it seems initially unfamiliar. If we understand them in those terms, in their family and in their cultural context, we can understand something of what it is that they're seeking to do here at Harris Manchester, or Manchester College as it is. The building that is built here is opened, as I said, in 1893. And in this chapel, the first principle of Manchester College describes its importance to those who had supported the college, those who had funded the college, those who had welcomed the college into Oxford, and those who were profoundly opposed to the idea of a Unitarian college in Oxford. And what's striking is the extraordinary self-confidence, this almost bullish approach that he takes. He doesn't apologise for Unitarianism, that's hardly surprising. But what he does is to describe how much Oxford has lost by excluding Unitarians. What he does is to describe the ways in which Oxford has been excluded from the national conversation because it has not included this important constituency. He says, in our long exile, we never relinquished our desire to return. So he makes it clear that they have been expelled, not that this is some new development as Unitarians come to Oxford. But also, he goes on to say, that Oxford had ceased to be a national institution at the moment that it excluded those that it would not absorb, those that it would not accept because they were Unitarian or nonconformist in other ways. What he's doing is he's making a claim about the nature of the Unitarian Church as not something separate or distinct, certainly not something inferior or second rate, but actually as part of the established church, as part of the establishment, as a key feature of the nation. And that is something that isn't distinctive to this institution. It's also something we can see elsewhere. Not in Manchester, for example, but in Leeds. In Leeds, in the 1840s, a new parish church is built, is now called Leeds Minster, in a distinctive local stone, in a distinctive local style, expressing a particular claim to the idea of Leeds as the, of the Anglican Church's place as the church in Leeds. And the Unitarians responded within 10 years by building their own church, in the same style, in the same stone, and making exactly the same claims. That in fact they are the church, just as much as the Church of England is. And that development in Mill Hill, in Leeds, is, I think, also found here. We don't have words from Thomas Worthington, predictably. We don't have words from Percy Scott Worthington about the decisions they were making here. But we do, predictably enough, from Hubert Worthington, who writes about what it is to build in Oxbridge. And as you've seen, he builds a lot. You can have a bit of fun with scenery, he says, an exhibition building or a shop front for powder puffs and camisoles. There's something about gender here, but I won't go on about it. Or a jazz nightclub. But if you're putting up a church or a law court or an addition to an Oxford college or a public school, you must give your design the quality of the eternal. He's quoting Wren there, of course. give a Bolshevik sculptor an important job on a public building, and the chances are he'll become as sane and sober as a Labour MP with cabinet responsibility. As I said, he's a figure of the establishment. But he's also making a claim for why this building had to be built in Gothic architecture. It has to be built in Gothic, not because that somehow is going to absorb Unitarianism into Oxford, not because somehow the Unitarians have got to make a claim that they belong here. The fact that it's being built in Gothic is just what you do. It's just what a college is, and that is why you absorb that design, and that is why you do not slavishly have to copy the Gothic that's already here. And that, in part, explains what's going on when Thomas Worthington and Percy, who's brought in to help design, is going to build here. They are going to build a Gothic building because this is an Oxford college, but the Gothic they use is going to resemble the Gothic that Thomas Worthington has always used in Manchester, not the Gothic that has always been used here. After all, remember that Thomas Worthington claimed that Manchester, like Siena, like Venice, was a place that was evolving its own style. And here we can see how that own style is brought to Oxford without shame, without embarrassment, but simply making the point that this is something that should have been here all along. And when Percy Worthington is employed to build the hall, well, what we see there is a continuation of that idea, but changed because, as I say, he has new stylistic commitments, he's interested in the arts and crafts, he's committed to another form of Gothic design. Both of these are unlike anything else in Oxford, and both of them are meant to be unlike anything else in Oxford. The social confidence they have, their commitment to progressive ideals, the simple success and importance of the Unitarians means nothing else will do. And that's why when we look at this, we find an obtrusively Unitarian building, a building that is obviously a product of Manchester, a building that is asserting, a college that is asserting its place in Oxford, and a building, a set of buildings that reflects their origins in Manchester, their origins in Unitarianism, and their origins as the product of the most remarkable architectural dynasty. Thank you very much.